Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Gateway API meeting for January 16th, 2023. This is a small, light, no agenda meeting because it's a holiday in the US today. So yeah, we're just going to talk about whatever today. So Dave, you had a thing?
Yeah, there was a
the last thing I forgot to say was, as always, code of conduct, be nice to each other. There's a Kubernetes meeting and so on and so forth. Now you're good.
Does the code of conduct include interrupting people?
It does, and I'm very rude, and I apologize.
I'm joking. There is a discussion in the Gateway API under the GitHub discussions section about cluster local. Just going to try to move that forward with the GEP. So far, I just included the intro, some goals, non-goals. I think the non-goals kind of want to avoid this getting lumped into gamma stuff, because when people think about like cluster local, like, oh, maybe you can also link to other clusters and can balloon into a larger discussion. I haven't included the implementation yet, even though Evan kind of just said like a really lightweight one in the GitHub discussion, but because it might be worth just thinking about some alternatives prior to figuring out what we want to do. So I'm just bringing it up here, see if anyone has comments, but I can also bring it up next week for a wider audience.
Yeah, I think, and I can definitely see, I understand the use case, like it's mainly kind of the hairpinning style use case, really. And so, yeah, I think it's very easy for people to see this as, service mesh light. So I think it's fair, but I think I would probably, to be honest, I would probably mention like it's effectively hairpinning, like, you're kind of going to the border, to the external border of the cluster, even though it's not really external, you know what I mean? Like you're going to the edge of the cluster and back in.
Yeah, what is your definition of hairpinning? So
it's like, yeah, so this is like a thing that you would do in sort of an old school data center network where you had a firewall that was like the border of your security domain. So hairpinning is when you sort of reach out to the outer edge of the firewall from inside, and then the traffic is routed back in. So it passes through the firewall rules. So it's like a hairpin term. So that's hairpinning.
Got it.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So that's kind of what this does, right? Like you're reaching like out to the outer edge of the gateway listener, even though the outer edge is kind of weird because it's using an internal address. But you want to do that because you want to be able to use the gateway style routing as though you were coming from outside the cluster. And that's
exactly.
Yeah. And so that's why hairpinning is a good one, because it's like you're not trying to do this like you want to use the same functionality just like it's pure ingress, but just with an internal, like a cluster IP style address or some other sort of internal address.
Exactly.
It's not visible on the internet.
Exactly.
And so, yeah, I think that's the sort of the crucial distinction here between decenter service mesh. Whereas a service mesh is you want to go straight to the service kind of, whereas this is like, it's kind of conceptually more like your hairpin, like I said.
Yeah, I try to capture that in like line 26. The reason why we require internal gateway so we can take advantage of layer 7 load balancing for our internal services. Hopefully, should I mention hairpinning, or is that just like
Yeah, I'll put a comment on there to something to that effect, that it's like, this is not like a full service mesh where you expect every service to have like, or a majority of services to have this functionality turned on. This is like, you want to expose a service on like an internal, like a non-public routed IP address. Is what, exactly. Yeah. So this is where internal and external gets a little bit confusing, because it's internal to your WAN, but not necessarily internal to the cluster.
Yeah,
you could do it with cluster IP servers if you make the cluster IP subnet range routable. That's one of the reasons that I haven't pushed too hard on this, is that you end up getting into the weeds of like, exactly how does the routing work, and how do you what internal address range are you exposing, and all that sort of stuff, that you can kind of hand wave away a lot when you're doing external IP addresses that are service type load balancer.
Yeah, exactly.
Essentially, yeah. yeah, so I'll put a comment on there in a minute, just saying what I just said.
Sounds good. And I'm gonna muse on the API stuff to see, just think about alternatives for the sake of it. So
yeah, cool. I think that's good. But yeah, I mean, I think it's worth sort of calling out that this is the same as, can we use a cluster IP for a for a list, for a gateway's address as well, or something, something similar. Like yeah, it's worth saying it's similar to that use case. Yeah. Yeah, and like, yeah, because I I spent a bit of time like playing around with Knative, so I understand what you're doing. You want to be able to have it so that you can have do Knative stuff, but that's not on a public IP address. That's the
exactly, yeah.
It's about avoiding the use of public IP addresses and using RFC 1918 address space, not about having the pods be directly reachable for one another.
Yeah, I added that as a reference, but if you think I need to clarify that a bit more, let me know.
If there's one thing I've learned from this entire process of writing Gateway API stuff, is that you can never clarify too much, because there's always someone who's like, oh, I didn't realize you meant. Yeah. And yeah, sometimes you've got to say it 4 or 5 different ways to people to really grok what you're talking about. Because yeah, everyone's brain works differently, and yeah. Cool. Okay, no worries. Yeah, I think I'll definitely have a look at that, and then I think that it's a good time to reopen the discussion there as well.
Sounds good.
Well, I guess do you guys have any other things that you want to talk about?
I do not.
Nothing from me.
Okay. I'm gonna use my super cow powers and derail into talking about the TLS use cases thing. I am trying to sort of resurrect that a little bit. Here's the so yeah, I updated this a little bit. I changed a couple of things where people had some comments, but then I also added one other thing on the end, which is client certificate settings. We currently don't have any way in the API to represent. I want things that are connecting to the outside of my listener to require a client certificate, and I want to do some sort of validation on that client certificate. That's why I left this as italicized and bolded to be clear that this is not about from the connections from the gateway to the back end using client certificates there. Yeah, so just for anybody watching the recording, yeah, that's what I've started poking on this again. I would like us to go back to this, because this is going to be required for us to do something about what ended up as backend properties and didn't end up going very well because it was too much crossover with Gamma. So I think that the more that we can tightly control, like if we're talking about TLS, we need to be extremely clear what TLS use case we're talking about. And that was the point of doing this TLS use cases gathering, was to try to be able to say, okay, what TLS use case are we talking about? Because it can be very confusing if someone is talking about HTTPS pass-through and the other people think about they're talking about termination and re-encryption, because they're kind of similar. But they have subtle and extremely important differences. So yeah, does anyone have anything they want to say there? Micaiah, I know that you all are interested in the backend encryption stuff. Is there anything you have there?
Sorry, I haven't looked at the most recent changes. We are very interested in both TLS pass-through and the decrypt, re-encrypt use cases. We don't have particularly fancy requirements around that. We really, at this point, we just want the basic functionality to be defined. So again, I haven't looked at the latest changes. From what I remember, I think what you have here is pretty good.
Yeah, I updated the wording on this. I had this as the settings are not the gateway's concern. And so what I was trying to say here was that, it's not the gateway's job to like tell the backend service what sort of like TLS certificates it should be using. The stuff that we need to add to the gateway API is about how do you tell the gateway that it needs to do MTL, that it needs to do TLS to the backend service, and what CA and stuff it should use. And so that's what I was trying to be really clear on there, because when you start talking about TLS to backends, people are like, oh, isn't that MTLS? It's like, well, sometimes. And sometimes it means the same thing as what people mean in service mesh when they say MTLS, and sometimes it doesn't. And in your case, the thing you really need, I don't think it does kind of mean exactly the same thing. But yeah, that's another case where we need to be really careful about the exact language you use, because it's otherwise there's very strong crossover into sort of gamma territory, and there's then there become a lot of other concerns. I think Mark's suggestion here about saying, maybe should we consider modeling the re-encryption as a filter is like, that's a kind of interesting idea. It would at least give us a place to hang the config off. But yeah, I think that's the problem, is like, as always, where do you hang the config and what do you put in the config? I think the problem with TLS backend properties, was that it was too broad, and there was too many applications. And I think that we're going to have much better success at designing something that's a bit more tightly focused.
One thing to add, because since you're saying workload owner, Knative trying to make internal TLS like an operator thing, because we control the sidecar. We just want to say, like, let operators say, turn on internal encryption. We'll just manage the certs for you, stuff like that. I don't know if that use case makes sense to capture here.
It would be in this case. So, I mean, that starts coming more into like what we're talking about for Gamma, where we're talking about, hey, MTLS in the service mesh use case is kind of an implementation detail. You're only talking about the service. You use the naming when you talk about the services, and the fact that it's encrypted in MTLS is not like important in terms of the routing. It's like an implementation detail. Whereas the use case that Micaiah is talking about it is important, because the workload owner, the person who actually owns the pods, has sort of configured their service to do TLS and require TLS. And thus, if you want to be able to forward traffic to it, your thing needs to do a TLS thing itself, or to do TLS faster.
So we're like a weird niche where it's like we do that automation for the user, by managing complexity in that sense.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I think there's nothing wrong with doing that, but like in that case, like it's it becomes kind of an implementation detail, where you kind of don't want the person who configures the gateway to have to configure the TLS that they're going to have to use to connect to all the backends, right? Like you want that to not be configured. So in that case, that means it's kind of like, this is a thing that you do in your implementation, and it's not relevant in terms of configuration. And that's the key.
Yeah, we don't want to expose even like any of the gateway users, just the end users of Knative. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you're going to be doing it, but this, and I guess maybe that's another thing that I'll go back and add in here, that this is not about you're doing magic TLS to the back end where everything is sort of auto TLS. This is about the service. The person who owns the service wants the TLS, wants to do their own TLS, and your gateway needs to know the correct way to connect to it, so that it can actually connect to the right port and do the right TLS dance.
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah, cool. Okay, no worries. That is a good point. I'll make sure I update that. Yeah. Just make a note here. Okay, that's good. Now I can now I can remember what I was going to write there. Cool. Okay, well, yeah. With that, I'll stop sharing. That's everything I had to talk about today. Do either of you guys have anything that you would like to talk about today? Otherwise, we can call it done and give everyone some more time back.
Nothing here.
End user question. Can you actually? I just gotta check the spec quickly. Hold on.
While you do that, Micaiah, were you going to ask something as well?
No, I was saying I don't have anything. Thanks.
Cool.
Is there is backend ref limited to Kubernetes services, or can you have a back ref as a different HTTP route?
So having a backend ref to be another HTTP route was one of the mechanisms we talked about for delegation and inclusion. That gap is kind of held up at the moment because it was a huge rabbit hole of shenanigans. And so yeah, you can use different kinds that are not service. Like that's why there's a full GVK selector in there.
Mm-hmm.
I would not recommend doing it with HTTP route unless you spend a lot of time. Have a read over the GEP and the PR, the update PR for the GEP that was sort of closed for staleness a while ago. There's a lot of discussion on there. But yeah, like if you want to allow a HTTP route to point to another HTTP route, you got to start thinking about how many layers deep do you want that to be? How do you prevent loops? How do you handle like people overriding stuff that you need them not to override, and a bunch of other problems like that.
I guess maybe I could backtrack and talk about my use case. We have something called domain mapping, essentially just like creating a top level domain for like but it's pointed at, for example, a Knative service, which would be fronted by a HTTP route. So really what I would think would be the implementation of it would be like, hey, for any routing that's hitting this host, rewrite the host to be this other host name, and then apply the routing rules of that.
Oh, I see. So like it's kind of like a host where all host names should host header rewritten. That is interesting.
Yeah, it's sort of like lets people bring like a custom domain over top of their usually Knative services have like namespace in their name and things like that, and this is how people kind of use it to expose things to a top level.
Right. Okay. Could you? I mean,
and it's a non-wildcard domain. Here's some reference.
Yeah. So is it important that the service name is the host name that the end thing sees? You know, like is it important that the host header matches the Knative domain?
You mean, does it get in terms of it being rewritten? Like what the
so from the backend owner's point of view, like the service that's actually running inside the whatever backend you're Knativing, does that need to see the Knative service name, or does it matter if it gets the domain name?
You know what? I think I don't know. I don't know what implementations do now. Yeah, I don't think it does.
Because if it doesn't, then the way that I would do that, to be honest, is just to create a gateway with like a bunch of listeners that have separate domains, and then have the HTTP routes, because you're controlling all of the specs for all of these things that are automatically created. I would have the HTTP routes then use the section naming thing of the parent ref, and so point to the thing to pick a particular listener, and just map it only to that thing, or just have a gateway per one if you can do that architecturally. But like the important part here is that you just have one listener per domain name that then points to all of the that maps that does exactly what your domain mapping is doing, and maps that listener to a route that describes that service.
I see. Okay.
Because the only reason, it feels like the only reason you would need that is if you really need if the backing service needs to see a specific domain name, right? That's why you need to do the domain rewrite in there. I mean, you can actually, and even then you could actually do that using like a host rewrite, using the header rewrite stuff. So you could do a header rewrite in a HTTP route you do to rewrite the service to the Knative thing. So rather than modeling it as like a route that routes to another route, it's just a listener that listens to the domain name, and then the route that routes all the traffic for that domain name out to the correct service.
I see. Okay. Yeah, I'll play with that then. I realize I need to do a giant like a mirror board of like use case, what are the resources I need to make.
Yeah. So
yeah,
and like, so I think like I'd certainly be having to look at that use to the mirror board for you, man, like, because I think it's one of the things that we need a lot more of, is that sort of cookbook style thing of like, I want to do this, and so we say, oh, the way you do this is to do, is to have a listener that points to the route, and blah blah blah, like, and there's a couple of other similar use cases that where people
exactly.
there was one where people were like, oh, I want to auto generate HTTP routes from a Swagger description, and they're like, oh, I want it to only allow the get, post and stuff that the Swagger says, and then they put it all into one HTTP route, and they were like, oh, I have too many route maps to fit in a HTTP route. And I'm like, well, that's because you're kind of doing it wrong. Like, you want to break those up a little bit, maybe have each endpoint be a separate HTTP route, rather than putting everything into one big HTTP route. And that's the exact sort of thing, right? I've got a to-do for myself to sort of say, hey, if you want to use, when you're using the Gateway API, like, here's some use cases that have come up, and here's how we think here's sort of the recommended way to do this. And the more that we can build a sort of a cookbooky thing like that, then I think that will help people, because it's a reasonably complex API, because it's got solving a large problem space, but that means that there are conceivably a lot of ways to do something like that, where there might be an easier way, like what I just said about listeners and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
sounds good.
Yeah, so if you make that mirror board, then we should try and turn that into like a cookbook style thing of, I want to do this. Here's how you set up your resources. Yeah.
And maybe my last question, has there ever been any discussion about automatic protocol negotiation with backends, so that the user might not even have to declare any like backend capabilities, like what protocol and what ports, etc.
Are you talking about something like ALPN or?
Yeah, if it's a TLS backend, I know it could do that.
But you mean like, oh, yeah, this is gRPC port, or this is a HTTP1 port or something like that?
Yeah, like just automatic negotiation on that side, or potentially discovering on the same port different protocols too.
Right.
Yeah.
In the absence of something like ALPN that's designed to do that, it seems like it would be hard. Like, if we're talking a HTTP, like a port 80, like and you want to do something in addition to HTTP, or HTTP already will auto negotiate versions for you, right? Like, it seems like it needs to be built into literally the layer 7 protocol that whatever layer 7 protocol you're using for the port.
Mm-hmm.
In like when I was working on Contour, we had a thing where, if you wanted to be able to specify which port to use for which type of traffic, there was like, in HTTP proxy, there was a thing that said, this is a TLS. I want Contour to do a TLS connection to the backend service, and you should use this port, rather than, you should use port 443 rather than port 80 or something. But yeah, and so like, I understand what you're saying. Like, it'd be nice to be able to have it be some sort of auto detection, but I don't know how we could handle all the conceivable use cases easily there. I think it seems like you could do an interesting like extension, like a policy attachment, or some other sort of meta resource that would describe something like that, or like describe how you should pick, because that's, in the absence of
I'm trying to avoid more resources. That's why.
Yeah, no, I get it. You've got a lot already, again, you could actually, it could be something where your implementation could be like, you do a HTTP route, and then it figures out like what port your implementation figures out what port the HTTP listener is listening on, right? Like it probes it out or something like that, right? But then that's an implementation detail, right? Like not a thing that we need to configure. I guess that's one of the key things that's really important to remember with a thing like Gateway API is like we need to put only the things that we really need people to be able to configure and know more, and leave the magic to be magic, and to be implementation specific. That doesn't mean that you can't, like, but it means like if you want to, like, we need to talk about it and maybe do something implementation specific. Like by that I mean the support level implementation specific, not just the generic term. Yeah, so yeah, it is an interesting use case, and I think there was a note in that TLS use cases thing about doing something with ALPN instead of just SNI, which would make sense to me. But we hadn't considered that earlier, so
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll take a look at that doc then.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, that's all I have.
Okay, cool.
Yeah,
Thanks,
Nick,
man. Good questions.
If you don't mind if I weigh in, I really agree with your point on we don't want things to be too implementation specific. We want things to be portable. I'd also add, I'm wary of too much magic. When we talk, you mentioned HTTP, HTTP2 negotiation using ALPN. That kind of thing scares me because HTTP2 has surprises like clients doing connection coalescing. So I'm always wary of too much magic, auto detection, that kind of thing. I definitely prefer explicit APIs and explicit configuration. If anything, you could have, where it makes sense, an option to say auto detect. If you want that as an explicit, yes, I want to auto detect what protocol to use. Otherwise, though, like I said, I would prefer explicit APIs where possible.
Yeah, we've been bitten by that HTTP2 connection coalescing.
Yeah.
I'm guessing everybody has.
Yeah,
everybody
it
has
seems like a bad, bad
I mean,
idea.
it's great for the end user, right? Like it's awesome, but it makes designing proxies and other intermediate things complicated.
Yeah, or you could override it per request or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. But so I think the thing that I was talking about there with ALPN was, seeing if it was possible to use some of the ALPN handshake stuff to for TLS routing, like in the same way you use the SNI. I can't remember the exact mechanisms and when it happens in the handshake, so I don't know if you can do it in the same way that you can with SNI, where you don't unwrap the packets and you just forward them on, and use ALPN as a routing discriminator to be able to say, oh, if you negotiate HTTP2, send it to this service. Otherwise, if it's HTTP1, send it to this service or something like that. So I mean that's I think the thing that we were talking about with ALPN, not anything more clever. And I don't even know if it's possible. I need to go and read the ALPN stuff again. Okay, cool. I'll put a couple of notes in there about some of the stuff we talked about. But I think with that, we're kind of done.
Cool. Sounds good.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone. Short meeting today. Enjoy the extra time in your day, and I will catch you all next week. Cheers.